Support for this podcast is brought to you by the Wyoming Humanities. We take a closer look at our human experiences and use stories to explore culture, history, and contemporary issues. You can find us on thinkwhy.org.
You know, homelessness can happen in the blink of an eye. It can happen to anybody. And it's not just people that are doing drugs or things, it's families. And it happens so quickly. It's on the increase, unfortunately, in America.
Hello, I'm Emmy DeGrappa. This is What's Your Why? Each week we bring you stories asking our guests the question why. We learn about their passion, why they do what they do, why should we care, and what can we learn? What better place to explore the human landscape than from the state known for its incredible landscapes, Wyoming? And what better organization than Wyoming Humanities? Serving our state for over 45 years, we share stories, ideas, and wisdom about the human experience. Welcome to What's Your Why? Today, we are talking to Nanci Turner Steveson. She grew up with a book in one hand, the reins of a pony in the other. She wrote her first novel at age 9 about a wild horse named Liberty. Nanci is a theater stage manager, writing instructor, and reading fairy to book-hungry children. And Nanci is an author. Welcome, Nanci.
Hi, thank you. Nice to see you.
Tell me about your books that you have published so far.
My debut book, I had a long journey to publication, so I was a little bit older than most people. But my first book was published in 2016 with HarperCollins, and I write for a middle grade audience, which is basically upper elementary and into middle school, although adults certainly seem to love my books, so maybe middle grade and up. Anyway, the first book, it's titled Swing Sideways, and it's a story. It's a very poignant story. It's a friendship story about a time when two girls really needed the other girl in their life, but had no knowledge of each other before. One was from Oregon, and one grew up in New York City in a very structured environment. They both had histories. They both had secrets, and they met on a farm one summer in upstate New York, and they go on a quest to find these ponies. And there's a lot of things that unfold, and the secrets that are held by each of them sort of drive this story to I don't want to say a tragic end. It's not a tragic end, but it's an end that is very poignant and very uplifting, but there is some sadness to it. But it's also, there's a lot of very positive resolution in the story. And it was actually one of the nominees for the Wyoming Indian Paintbrush Award this year, and was picked up by Scholastic for their book fairs. You know, book fairs, everybody loves the book fair at school. So it was one of those books as well. So I was very proud of that. My second book is titled Georgia Rules, and that actually came out almost a year to the day afterwards. And that is a story, it's about a girl who moves from Atlanta, Georgia, from a sort of country club life with this very Southern belle mother, and they moved to a very rural farm in Vermont after her father passed away, and she didn't know her father. And she doesn't want to move to this rural place in Vermont. She, thinks it's Hicksville. Over the course of time, she learns a lot about her father, which in turn she learns a lot about herself, and meets this fabulous family, the Parker family, and they have, it's two moms, and they have 6 kids, adopted kids, foster kids, and their natural-born children who are nothing like any family that she has ever been around. And then I have, my third book comes out next January, and that's titled Lizzie Flying Solo, and that's the story of a recently homeless girl who loves a pony that she cannot have.
What was the inspiration for that?
I had some experiences with homeless people, with homeless families that really, really touched me and moved me and changed me in a way that it's very hard to explain. But I interviewed a woman once for a job, and she had raised her kids as teenagers living in transitional housing shelters because they had become homeless. And so she was telling me how her kids never wanted to make friends because they didn't want to go to a new friend's house and then have to reciprocate, because they didn't want people to know that they were living in these shelters. And I was really moved by that. And, homelessness can happen in the blink of an eye. It can happen to anybody. And it's not just people that are doing drugs or things, it's families. And it happens so quickly, and there's so many that it's on the increase, unfortunately, in America. Families with children that are homeless, and it was something that I was very inspired by. I've been a horse girl my whole life, so of course there's a magnificent relationship between this girl and this sort of rogue pony who she really just loves, and they both sort of, again, find each other at that right moment. It doesn't end the way that people think that it might, but it ends with a really positive outlook.
For your book, Swing Sideways, did you also draw from a real-life experience when you wrote that book?
The setting for that book is actually based on a farm in upstate New York near where I spent my summers. And so there's a little bit of me. In Swing Sideways, the main character, her name is Annabelle, and she goes by Annie, or she changes her name to Annie after she meets her new friend, California. Annie has some history with some eating disorders, and it's never brought up in the book. I never say anorexia. I never say panic attacks, anything like that. But it's clear that this is a place that she's coming from, and this is a summer, a transitional summer for her. And there's a little bit of myself in there. And this farm was a farm that I just coveted. I just loved this farm. It belonged to a friend of mine and her family, and I spent every minute there that I possibly could. And it's just always been in my heart. And those are the kinds of things that you carry throughout your life and that end up coming out on the page in hopefully a really beautiful way because they were so magnificent in your life.
In your biography, you talk about how you were a voracious reader from a very young time.
Yes.
What do you think influenced that? What do you think was your inspiration?
I come from a large family. There's 6 kids in my family, and so there was always so much going on. There was always so much noise. And when you open the pages of a book when you're a child, you sort of dive into this other place. All of your stuff goes away. I like to say that you go into this magical place where the rules of the real world don't apply, and you can put yourself in there. And it just was magnificent to me. I mean, I read constantly, and in fact, when I was 9 and I read Black Beauty, I remember very distinctly closing that book and knowing that someday I would be an author. I was going to write for the age that I was right then, because books really sort of helped pull me through a tricky time in my life. And they would have to do with ponies also and horses. So it was at age 9 that I knew that.
And you grew up around horses?
I did. My family did not. They were not horse people at all. My mother says that she doesn't know the front end from the back end, and that's pretty much true. I rode a pony the first time when we went to visit Ireland when I was 3. I remember it like it was yesterday. I remember what the girl was wearing. I remember what the pony looked like. I remember what the road looked like that we were riding on. And it changed my life. And from that moment on, I was obsessed with horses.
Do all your books have to do with horses?
So far, actually, Swing Sideways is the 2 girls go on a quest to find these ponies, and they're not visible until a certain point in the book. So it's not like that's not the driving force of the book. In Georgia Rules, there's a very naughty pony by the name of Sassy Pants, who I have an old boss from Horse Farm that used to say that ponies are reincarnated axe murderers, and Sassy Pants was sort of the classic reincarnated axe murderer pony. In Lizzie Flying Solo, this is one of those really magnificent girl and pony relationship things that happen. And so it's much more horse-centric, and a lot of it takes place at this stables that she's able to sort of get herself into so she can be near this pony, even though she's living in a homeless shelter.
Your first book came out just a couple of years ago, right? Swing Sideways.
Yes.
And so you had a long journey.
I did have a long journey. I did.
What was that journey like? You didn't get discouraged? Were you submitting?
Well,
works?
fortunately, I have a really mean brother. No, that's terrible to say. I wrote from the time I was 9. I never stopped, and in fact, when I do school visits, I go as an author into schools and teach kids, and I show them these things that, thank goodness, my mother saved for me, because I have all these things that I wrote, and she even wrote my age and everything on there. But in my early 20s, I decided that I was going to try and get published with magazines. And I have a brother who is a very, very good writer, and he's a copy editor, actually. So I would send him things, and these things would come back with red marks all over them. And in fact, this was back in the day when you had to pay for your long distance phone calls, right? And his wife, who was very frugal, called me on the phone and she said, I just need you to know when this comes back and you open it and you see all the red marks all over what you wrote. He really does believe in you. Don't take this to heart, because it was awful. But what it did is it made me realize, okay, I have work to do. I come from a family of 6 kids. The other 5 and my parents all graduated from either Ivy League colleges or University of Texas Plan 2, which is for the genius people. And I didn't go to college. So I had a lot of work to do, and I knew that, and really what my brother did is he taught me that. And then I was raising my kids. I was married, I had 2 children, I got a divorce. I was raising my kids by myself. I was working 2 different jobs. And writing was the thing that I did that I just thought someday in the future, this might be something that I can give my kids. This might be something that will provide me with a little bit of stability, financial stability in my life. Maybe, who knows? But of course, this is in my 30s. So I go through my 30s and my 40s. And I was managing an equestrian center in Maryland, very, very large equestrian center. And there were so many stories that were just rising up from me. And I knew that in that job, there was no way that I would be able to do it, because that job was 75 hours a week, and it was 75 tough hours a week. So I left that job because I knew that it was time. At that point, it was time for me to go educate myself more, do whatever I needed to do to get published, because it was time. So I left that job and went to a job that was sort of something that I didn't have to think very much about. So at the end of the day, I had a lot of creativity left. And I would write into the night. I would write till 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. And I just kept learning and learning. I went to workshops. I went to conferences. I had critiques from editors, from other authors. I joined every group that I possibly could. And I listened to what they said. And I really studied what they said. And I read and I read and I read. And that's how I taught myself how to write.
You really did teach yourself.
I did teach myself, yeah. But you have to be able to, it takes a lot of grit, and it takes, good listening skills.
And a lot of passion.
A lot of passion, yes.
What do you tell young people that you work with about writing and about becoming an author, and your struggles and how you can inspire them?
So I have 3 rocks that sit on my desk near my computer. And one of them says imagine. One of them says create, and the other one says believe. And I always show these to the kids. And I say, when you imagine it, that's a great thing. Imagine it. Go crazy with it. Create it. Put it on paper. If you feel the need to put this on paper, you put it on paper. And then I always tell them I want them to write down those 3 words, and then underneath believe, they underline it 3 or 4 times. And I said, you must believe in yourself, because it's a grueling journey. It's not easy. And getting published it's not easy, but it is just such an incredible top of the mountain sort of experience, when this happens. And so there are children, when I work with kids, I can see there are kids that just like to sort of mess around and write something, and that's great. But there are kids that need to put stuff on the page, that need to get stuff down. And so I always want to encourage them, and I show them the things, and I tell them about my journey. And I say, look, this is what I wanted from the time I was 9. I was 56 years old when my first book was published, or sold. I'm sorry, when my first book was sold. That's a long time to work, but I needed to do it. I wanted to do it. And if you want to do it, you can do it. There is nothing that can stop you. And I also talk about when I was a kid, well, I still have a learning disability that made it difficult for me in school. I was that kid in school that my report cards were always, the teacher would always write, oh, Nanci could do so much better if she could only pay attention, or if she could get her work done on time, or if she would turn her work in, things like that. And I really struggled with that. So I make a point to tell those kids, don't let that stop you. There are ways to work around it. There are ways to learn how to do this. If you really want it, you can do anything that you want to do. And that goes for anything. I mean, I try to make sure that they understand it's whatever, if they want to be a mathematician and they can't add or subtract or whatever, if they're willing to put the work in and they really want to do it, they can do whatever they put their mind to. What
draws you to this age group in writing?
So I think one of the things is because it was that age for me that I had a tricky childhood. And that was an age where I was really engrossed in books that sort of pulled me out of some kind of unhappy moments. But also the other thing, the really great thing is this is the age of kids that when kids are very, very impressionable, and when you make or break a reader at that age, and so you have an opportunity to really make a difference in a child's life, because people that can read and that do read and that enjoy reading and look forward to reading as adults have, much more empathy, more of everything that's really good. But the other thing is that it's also an age when the books prior to this don't sort of push the boundaries too much of things that are maybe considered to be outside the norm. So if you have a child in a school who has a lifestyle that maybe other people look down on, if they see themselves in the pages of a book, it's like you're saying to them, you're okay. It's okay. You really are okay. And it's huge for them. They're just about to get pushed off the edge of the cliff into adolescence, which we all know is difficult and tricky. And in providing books, really good, solid books, and you're giving them sort of a foundation for their jumping point so that there is some relief, there are some things taken away from them as far as their own self-esteem. There's just so many things. The other thing is that a lot of kids, that are they grow up in this homogenous society, and they don't get to experience things that have to do with diversity. And understanding and sort of embracing diversity also increases empathy. It gives them a broader perspective of what life is really about. And they end up growing up to be more well-rounded adults.
My last question is, how do you think social media has changed kids' reading habits, really, or influenced them, or maybe not in a good way, or maybe in a good way?
I think it's sort of a double-sided sword sort of thing. Here's my take on it. This is just my take. There's a big difference when you are reading something on social media versus when you're reading something that's in a book. And when you're reading something out of a book, you're really getting more depth of feeling, and you're experiencing more things. There's a difference between reading a book and sinking yourself into the life of somebody who lives in Africa, in a tribal community in Africa or something, and you're part of that. Okay, you're part of that experience. Versus reading it on the internet, you're getting some facts and things, but you're not getting the passion, you're not getting the feeling, you're not getting the real life things. So I think in that respect, when I first had an agent, I had an agent for several years before we actually sold my first book. And it was right when the economy dropped and kids were going to social media a lot more. They were also reading on Kindles, which is great. Any way you read a book, to me, is great. It became a little stagnant, especially the age group that I write for and the genre that I write for. It became a little bit stagnant, but that is changing. That's turning around. In fact, in Italy, there was just a huge conference and thing that happens in Italy every year. And what came out of that was that this actual age group, which had sort of been squashed, with the rise of young adult fantasy things, the middle age group had sort of been squashed, and it's beginning to rise again and become much more meaningful in a child's life.
And that's positive.
That is fabulous. That's wonderful. Yeah.
Well, I thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you for having me. Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it.
I love
it. Thank you for listening. I'm Emmy DeGrappa. This Think Why podcast is brought to you by the Wyoming Humanities. We use the humanities as a lens to explore the human experience. You can find us online at thinkwhy.org.